Hello and welcome to the September Crane Research Forum. Thank you for joining us today. We're very glad that you're here. My name is Dr. Rebecca Dorr, and I'm the Director of Research here at the Crane Center for Early Childhood Research and Policy. My colleague Kathy is going to be monitoring our chat box today, and we'll be adding housekeeping items there, as well as some useful links along the way. These monthly forums feature research on emerging or key topics that impact the field of early childcare and education. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome two of Crane's own top researchers, Dr. Laura Justice and Dr. Kelly Purtell. Dr. Justice is the Crane Center's Executive Director and the College of Education and Human Ecology's Distinguished Professor of Educational Psychology here at OSU. Dr. Justice is an expert in early cognitive development and disabilities, whose research focuses on enhancing the well-being and life potential of young children. Her global research portfolio includes active collaborations in Denmark, Hong Kong, China, Australia, Mexico, and New Zealand. She's also received the Presidential Early Career Award in Science and Engineering from President Bush, 2 Fulbright Awards, and numerous scientific merit awards for research publications. Over the past decade, she's led more than $55 million in federally funded research projects, which includes her current work as principal investigator on the kindergarten transition practices study that we'll be talking about today. Dr. Purtell is a faculty associate at the Crane Center and an associate professor of human development and family science in OSU's College of Education and Human Ecology. Her research centers on understanding how contextual factors shape health and development among low-income children and adolescents, and on how policies and programs can positively impact the developmental trajectories of these children. Many of her current projects focus on practices and policies related to early childhood education and their influences on children's development. She was recently named a Scarlet and Gray Associate Professor and has also received the Foundation for Child Development's Young Scholars Award. Dr. Purtell is a co-investigator on the kindergarten transition practices study. Today, Drs. Justice and Purtell will provide a theoretical framework for understanding the kindergarten transition. They will also detail distinctive differences in preschool and kindergarten settings and define the common challenges that children face in their transition. Finally, they will discuss findings from the Kindergarten Transition Practices Study, a federally funded randomized controlled trial in which their team has been experimentally testing a classroom and home-based program for facilitating kindergarten transition. I know we are in very competent hands today and that it's going to be a fantastic presentation. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Justice.
Great, thank you. I didn't know that we were going all formal with these long bios. Thank you, Rebecca. That was very nice. I'm going to be co-presenting with Kelly, and Kelly was actually a co-PI for KTP. This is not a project I would have ever done solo. And Kelly and the larger KTP team, we did everything we're talking about today. We actually did through COVID. And so we have a lot of our team here today. And later when Kelly talks more formally about the kindergarten transition practices or KTP study, hopefully some of the folks on our team who did yeoman's work out in the field, keeping this study going, they can chime in. So we're going to talk about challenges and possibilities in the kindergarten transition. And I'm going to kick us off by talking about the importance of the kindergarten transition and challenges in the kindergarten transition. And then Kelly's going to take you through, as Rebecca mentioned, a large-scale randomized control trial where we were trying to enhance children's transition into kindergarten. I will say that at the Crane Center, there's a large group of us who are really obsessed with kindergarten. Kindergarten is what we view as the first significant transition that kids experience in their educational experiences. So you have kids who, and I'll mention this in a second, you have kids, especially in Ohio, who have a real hybrid of an early education experience, from participation in family-based childcare to formal preschools to kin care and so on. And then you bring all these kids together in this formal kindergarten environment. And that's the first of many, many transitions kids experience. They transition into middle school, into high school, into some sort of post-secondary education. And in life, transitions are hard. Think back to any transition you recently experienced. Maybe you got married, maybe you had a baby, maybe you took a new job, maybe you got a new car. Those are transitions, and transitions are a period of great promise and vulnerability. So, as I mentioned, the transition to kindergarten is the first major shift in children's early learning settings. So as kids go from their early care and education experiences, they go into kindergarten, and suddenly they're in a classroom that often is a bigger size. Maybe you have one teacher for 20 children, whereas the ratio was smaller where kids were before. They have lots of new peers running around who are perhaps more diverse and interesting and unique and complicated compared to kids in their early learning settings. You have all these new rules and guidelines kids have to follow. And you have really new enhanced learning standards and goals for kids. And in fact, preschool children, when they have the opportunity to ask kindergartners what kindergarten is like, preschoolers ask questions like, is it true you have to sit still for a long period of time? Is it true that you don't really get to play much anymore? You know, preschoolers are really curious about what they know is a big shift. And as I mentioned, kids who come into kindergarten come from a wide variety of prior settings. Maybe they were in a district affiliated pre-K that feels more like kindergarten, or they were home with parents. Perhaps they were in a part or full day Head Start program. Many children in Ohio are participating in family-based care, and then you have lots of private care. And in fact, lots of kids from 0 to 5 are moving in and out different types of care arrangements. So when we think of a typical kindergarten child, there really is no typical prior experience that characterizes all kids. And so with so much variability in those early learning settings, kids come into kindergarten highly variable as well. So we were interested in what is the transition to kindergarten actually like for children, and we wanted to understand, is it challenging like we sometimes hear? And in a study that I'll describe more fully on the next slide, we had kindergarten teachers report of the challenges that kindergartners faced in a sample of 688 kindergarten kids in 45 kindergarten classrooms. And as you can see here, here's some of the background characteristics of our sample. And these are kids in Ohio. This is a study that Kelly and I, with others, led from 2015 until recently. It was a longitudinal study. And we did interviews with teachers and administrators in 25 school districts across Ohio. And we did an in-depth look at what was happening in 180 preschool to grade 3 classrooms, and we followed 700 kids from kindergarten to grade 3. That study was called Early Learning Ohio, and what I'm sharing right now before we shift to the KTP project is some knowledge we acquired as a function of the ELO study. So for those 688 kids, we gave questionnaires to 45 kindergarten teachers, and we asked, you know, on a scale of 0 to 4, from 0, no difficulties, to 4, great difficulties, did each kindergarten child experience challenges in the transition to kindergarten in 5 areas: making friends, following schedules, dealing with the new academic demands, working in groups, and being organized. And so those are commonly the 5 areas that we see kids having challenges with. And what you see is, I'm just going to highlight for you this light blue. These are the kids that teachers said they had no challenges at all in each of these areas. And those range from about 42 to 48%. So what you have is about half of kids had no problems and the other half did. And they tended to have difficulties across more than one of these areas. So what you see is roughly half of kids experience some difficulties across these areas as they transition to kindergarten. What's really important about that is when we looked at academic and social development for kids from fall of K to spring of K, what we found is that kids who have more transition difficulties rated by their teachers actually had smaller growth in literacy and math during kindergarten. And that's over and above the baseline skills that kids brought with them to kindergarten. So having transition difficulties appears to make a unique contribution, and in a negative way, to language and math growth over kindergarten and social development. We don't know why kids are having so many transition difficulties, but we do believe in part that there's a lack of alignment between what pre-K looks like and K looks like, and that creates a really unique set of challenges for children to deal with, especially in Ohio, where we don't have a universal cohesive system of pre-K across the state. So in that same ELO study, we did in-person observations in 120 pre-K, kindergarten, and first grade classrooms in Central Ohio. And we did in-person manually coded observations of what was happening in terms of grouping practices, type of instruction, time and academic content. And what we found is that kids really have to make quite a leap as they jump from the pre-K context to the K in grade one context. So this is what we found for grouping practices. And I'm going to move through this pretty quickly, but we do have some resources, white papers that Kelly and I and others have crafted via the Crane Center that provide greater detail. And so Kathy will be providing those references. But let's just take exposure to small group instruction. Or actually, here's a better one. Large group or whole class instruction, where the whole class comes together. For pre-K kids, that's about a third of their time. And then they jump to kindergarten and first grade, and it's veering towards more, moving towards half the time they're spending in whole class instruction. And here what you see is this small group instruction is about a fourth of pre-K time, a little bit less in K, and then by first grade, kids are getting very little small group instruction. So pre-K looks a lot different than K. Here you go to the type of instruction, and what you see here is that pre-K kids are spending a lot of their time in free play and center time, about 40% of the time. And by the time they get to kindergarten, they're getting much more direct instruction, a very little free time. I'm sorry that my fingers are making my slide jump around. And then when you look at time and academic content, this is the one that I felt most striking, is you have kids in pre-K spending a lot of time that would be considered non-academic. It's free play center time, about half the day. And look at that huge leap in kindergarten and first grade, where you see language and literacy really dominate the time across the day. And so what you see here is pre-K looks qualitatively different than what happens in kindergarten, first grade. And so that lack of alignment, we would speculate, is making that transition more challenging for children. So what I'm going to do now is shift to my collaborator, Kelly, to talk about the work we've been doing trying to enhance the kindergarten transition for entering kindergartners.
Great. Thanks, Laura. That is a great setup. I'm getting distracted by all of the great questions that we have in the chat and the Q&A. And so we'll be sure to leave time for us to come back to all of them at the end. But I echoing what Laura said, this kindergarten, and particularly the transition into kindergarten, is something that I think obsession is kind of the right term for us at the center in terms of our interest. And for Laura and I and our colleagues, we were learning all of these things from our early learning project, and at the same time thinking, well, what can we do to improve this transition? And so from that emerged our work on what we call KTP. And so when we were thinking, how can we improve the transition, there's certainly the alignment piece of the work, but we also we're really interested in other models that were out that focused on connections. And so the theory here is twofold. One is that kindergarten transitions are experienced by many people. It is not just the children experiencing them, but we need to think about their families, as well as the schools they're leaving, the schools they're entering, and the larger community around them. And that improving connections across these different groups of people is a really potent way to improve the kindergarten transition. And so some of the ways in which this happens is, one, it can create more alignment, whether it's in the academic things that Laura was talking about, or in smaller things such as behavioral expectations, or the ways in which kids are interacting. And the more that we can create alignment between children's experiences in the home, in preschools, and in kindergarten, hopefully the easier that becomes, and potentially the fewer challenges that we see kids experience. Stronger connections can also increase communication. So if you can increase connections between parents and teachers, they might feel more comfortable talking to one another when a problem does arise with a child, and things can be problem solved much sooner, so that maybe some of these challenges don't translate into the lower gains that Laura was talking about. And it can just increase the support that children and families are feeling, knowing that the school and the community understands that the transition is challenging and is providing supports towards that, can go a long way in making the experience easier. And so this original work, I'm thinking about connections, happened in the early 2000s by researchers Rim Kaufman and Pianta, but this model has really continued. And is it now it's, oh, there we go. In recent times, this model has been more fully developed. And so what this picture is really showing is what I was just talking about, which is kids are embedded in environments. And in order to help them navigate this transition, we need to think about these environments before they transition to kindergarten, after they transition to kindergarten, and how they're connecting to one another. And so there's kids who are in classrooms, their families are connecting to these classrooms, and all of this is embedded in a larger social and cultural environment and in communities that can provide resources and supports through the whole process. So the approach that we took is twofold. We thought to effectively target connections, we needed to take kind of a multifaceted approach. And so we have a project that targets what kids are experiencing in preschool or pre-K. And in that work, we're largely working with teachers and school personnel to think about how can we better prepare kids and parents and families for what they're going to experience in the transition. And then we also added on a home visiting component. Prior research has shown that home visiting is a really great way to help build connections with parents, particularly in these early years. And so we wanted to be sure to include that component. And with all of this, the goal was to end up with children and families that are prepared for the transition to kindergarten. The key to this project is the idea of a transition coordinator. We are fortunate that we have some of our transition coordinators, as well as other project personnel, on the Zoom today. So I'm hoping if questions come up specific to some of the work they did, that they happen to chat, and are willing to help fill in the blanks to some of the things that I'm talking about. But the transition coordinators essentially carried out the project. So they completed home visits with families. They worked with preschool teachers to implement the different activities that I'll talk through. But they also were there as a source of support and someone to help troubleshoot any issues that arose, starting from the beginning of that preschool year prior to kindergarten, through January of that kindergarten year. So they were really building connections that were lasting for about a year and a half. Our transition coordinators were selected because they had experience working with families and working in early childhood. And they also went through extensive training on best practices for working with families, cultural competence, home visits, and were really designed to be empowered to work with these families and teachers in meaningful ways over a period of time. And so through their work, we focused on 6 key connections in the transition, and you can see them listed here. I'm going to talk through each of those connections in terms of both what our goals were for strengthening these connections, as well as what some of the activities were. I'm going to talk through these fairly quickly so that we have time for questions at the end. But the materials that Kathy's sharing in the chat have these visuals, so you can always go back and read them more carefully there. But the first connection is child-parent connection. And so with this, we're really just looking to, one, ensure that children and parents have a strong, positive relationship, but also that parents feel empowered and have the resources to provide home learning opportunities that might enhance some of the skills that kids need to be successful when they enter the kindergarten classroom. So through our home visiting, we provided home learning materials and talked to families about ways to use these materials. We would follow up about what barriers they might face to doing this, as well as had conversations about developmental level of children, and thinking about ways to help prepare children as they move closer to kindergarten and then through that transition. Our next is parent-teacher connection. So this is really thinking about the parent-teacher relationship from the parent perspective. So the first, I'm going to go back one. The first thing that we did in our first 2 home visits is conduct a family needs assessment, which was really conversations with families about what were the things that they felt that they needed or that they wanted assistance on in terms of both raising their children, but specifically working with their children's preschool and kindergarten. We then worked with parents to talk about what barriers they might have to engaging in their children's school or attending events at schools and things like that. And we also helped them brainstorm ways to reach out to kindergarten teachers during the transition, as well as help create packets of information about children that parents could give kindergarten teachers. 1, to provide information, but 2, to help provide a starting point to building relationships. Next, we focus on children and peers. So we know that peers are a critical part of success and, frankly, enjoyment in school for children. And so we wanted to make sure that every kid was transitioning to school with the skills that they needed to build friendships. And so thinking back to what Laura was presenting in our challenges data, that was one where we saw about half of the kids were reported as having challenges with peers. And so we thought it was really important to think about this connection. And we did this by working with parents and teachers in preschool to make sure that kids were having experiences that facilitated friendships while they were in preschool, and also developing the skills that they would need to either maintain or develop new friendships in kindergarten. We also took an explicit transition focus on this connection, where we really tried to connect kids to peers in their preschools that might be going to the same kindergarten classrooms with them. And that involved a lot of coordination on our project team. But we tried to maybe have them in small groups in their preschool classroom with kids that were likely to go to the same kindergarten as them, or hosting events over the summer for kids that were matriculating into the same school or potentially even the same kindergarten classroom, and just really giving them an opportunity to start building these friendships prior to entering the kindergarten classroom. We also wanted to make sure that parents had an opportunity to connect to the community and to take advantages of learning opportunities in the community, whether that was from libraries or museums or other entities local to them. And we did a lot of work to prepare localized materials for each family. But it also was to think about how can we begin to build a larger community focused on the kindergarten transition, where teachers and administrators and other personnel from preschools and from elementary schools and from the other community organizations that touch families, how can we start bringing these people together to really focus on improving this transition for all children and families? Teacher-parent connections. This is really thinking about that teacher-parent relationship from the teacher's point of view, and how can we help teachers establish positive relationships with all of the parents of children in their classroom. And so both with preschool teachers and kindergarten teachers, we would help them establish contact with families, maintain periodic contact. So particularly in the preschool year, we worked with teachers to hold a number of events throughout the year, or to build on to existing events, to really engage parents and families within the classroom or within activities at night. We also worked to create newsletters to send home that teachers could use, that they could personalize to each child in the class, as another way of increasing communication, which ultimately might lead into a stronger connection. And then lastly, we talked about how do we build child-teacher connections. So as Laura talked about, one of the things that happens during this preschool to kindergarten transition is a much bigger child-teacher ratio typically. And so establishing that relationship between a child and a teacher can be harder, because there's so many more children in the classroom and there's all these other competing demands. And so throughout the preschool year, we worked with both preschool teachers and parents to think about how can we help support children in creating these positive relationships with teachers. But we also did a lot of work trying to help children be prepared for these big shifts, with the idea that the more prepared they are, the easier they'll transition and the easier it'll be for them to form positive relationships with their teachers. So we have these kindergarten ritual activities that would occur in the spring of the preschool year, really designed to simulate and get kids understanding some of the things that they might need to, ways they may need to act, but also things that they might experience when they move to the kindergarten classroom. And so all of these activities that we did were designed to be flexible. And so what we did in this project was we worked with parents and we worked with teachers in their schools to think about what are your strengths? What are you already doing? What are the things, we don't want to duplicate something that you're already doing really well, or to provide you with resources that just aren't going to be useful to you because you already have a good handle on that. So for example, with school districts, some school districts, their kindergarten enrollment process was really seamless and really easy on parents. So we didn't offer extra enrollment sessions, but for districts where maybe it was a bit more complicated, we would hold sessions to help parents understand kindergarten enrollment paperwork and things like that. And so the whole point of this program was to provide families and schools with resources that are helpful to build connections, but not necessarily to have the program doesn't look identical school to school or family to family. Within that, we kind of have two levels of this project. And so the first is KTP Classroom, which focuses on all of the things I talked about that the transition coordinators did with teachers and with schools. So sending the newsletters home, planning events for parents and families, implementing the kindergarten ritual lessons, planning social events prior to kindergarten entry. All of those things were kind of part of this classroom focused aspect of it. But as I said earlier, we also really wanted to work more directly with families. And so what we were calling KTP Plus, because it's an add-on to the classroom, is where we also conducted 9 home visits. These were done by transition coordinators. Typically, the same transition coordinator met with the family 9 times. And as I said, they were about every other month, starting from the fall of preschool, that last preschool year, through January of the kindergarten year, to really be a resource during this whole transition. Thus far, we've implemented this project in 28 school districts across Ohio. We've worked with kind of public pre-K, Head Start, and private preschools in terms of implementation. And we've been in rural, suburban, and urban environments for this implementation. As Laura mentioned, we've been doing this through COVID. And so I'm going to present some initial findings today, and this is from our cohort that started the program prior to COVID. The initial shutdown occurred during the spring of these children's kindergarten years, so we still have really good data on what happened in preschool with them. And then I'm also going to zoom in to really focus on this connection between teachers and parents. This paper was something that we did during the pandemic when we were, waiting on being able to do our other things. And so we'll have a lot more results to come, including results on both of our cohorts. But for now, we're going to just talk about these initial findings. And so for this part, our first cohort was 52 classrooms in 29 different preschool programs. And in our first year, we were primarily in more urban areas. We worked with 391 children. They were on average 55 months old. And our sample of children was 44% African-American, 30% white, 11% Hispanic, and 15% multiracial. And our sample was experiencing economic disadvantage. So our median income was between $20,000 and $30,000 for these households. And we didn't see a huge range on that. It was pretty limited in terms of how much money these families had at the time. So as Rebecca mentioned in the introduction, this is an experimental design. So we did a randomized control trial really designed to test the causal impacts of this program on children and families. And so, as I said, we started with 52 classrooms and 391 children. And the first thing we do is we randomly selected half of those classrooms to receive KTP and half of those classrooms to be in our control group. And when we talk about our control group, we often talk about business as usual. So these children were still getting all of the normal kindergarten transition activities that their school provides. But the KTP group was getting that plus the things that we were providing through our transition coordinators. Within that KTP, that group of KTP classrooms, we then did randomization again at the child level, where we randomized to either getting KTP plus, which added the home visits on top of the program, or children just receiving the KTP classroom. So we could really begin to parse apart, is the home visiting adding something above and beyond the rest of the intervention? And I'm going to talk through just two initial research questions here. One, did KTP impact preschool teachers' perceptions of parent engagement? So this is one of the key connections in our model. And we also know that there's a lot of literature showing that teacher perceptions of parent engagement is a really strong predictor of how kids do in school and how they do over time. And so we really wanted to see, was our program impacting this? We also wanted to see if these impacts varied by a series of characteristics. And so one of those characteristics was race ethnicity. We know from prior research that minoritized families experience more barriers to school engagement. They often can feel less welcome at schools, and are also subject to language barriers in some cases, inaccurate stereotypes in some cases. And so we really wanted to see, was our program differentially impacting families from different racial and ethnic backgrounds. We also looked at maternal education. We know that when parents come from lower levels of education, they also can experience barriers to parent engagement. So we wanted to see, did our program vary by that? And lastly, we looked at children's behavioral control. So any of you that are parents or teachers know that when kids are demonstrating behavior problems, that can very quickly become a source of tension between parents and teachers. And so we really wanted to look at that as a subgroup as well. So as I said, teachers were the ones reporting here, and they reported on three aspects of engagement. They reported on parents' involvement, how much communication was happening, how much teachers were how much parents were coming to events or volunteering in the classroom. Teachers also reported on their perception of their relationship with the parents, as well as their perceptions of parents' values about education and how much they felt parents valued their child's education, as well as how aligned they felt that their values were with the school system. For those of you who care about some of the analytic details, I'm going to quickly give you a couple. We did have missing data in this project, although the missing data was the patterns were not impacted by whether they were treatment or control or by kind of any of the information we collected at the beginning. And so we addressed this through multiple imputation. We used multi-level models because we had kids nested within classrooms. We included covariates. I'll show you results with and without covariates, but we included covariates to increase the precision of our findings. And when you do experiments, it's really important, even though you randomize, to make sure that the children and families that end up in your treatment group, or in this case, our KTP group, are similar to those in the business as usual control group. And when we did those comparisons, we saw no differences. So our randomization worked. And we can kind of look at our causal impact results. And so what you see, there are a lot of numbers on this slide, but I just want to highlight what we saw in terms of overall impacts was that KTP had impacts on parent involvement. This was, interestingly, primarily for those in the classroom level intervention, not the one that had home visiting added on. But if you look at that D column, those are our effect sizes, and having a 0.38 or a 0.37 is a pretty meaningful amount of difference to show. And so this was kind of our first impact, showing that it was on parent involvement. But however, I will say we did not see that teachers thought there were differences in relationships or values. We then look to see, do these vary across these different subgroups that I talked about a few minutes ago? And when we looked at parents or moms' education and children's behavior problems, we didn't see that there were different impacts. But we did see that the impacts varied by race, ethnicity, with some additional impacts for specific subgroups. And so I'm going to walk through those. So this is parent involvement. So this is the one, if you remember, we did see that overall impact for the KTP classroom. And what you see here is that when you look at families reporting that they're from white, non-Hispanic backgrounds, we see that same impact where the KTP classroom had higher teacher-reported parent involvement. However, when we look at both our Black, non-Hispanic and our Hispanic families, we see the impact is with the KTP plus. So both of those groups were reported as having higher parent involvement in the KTP plus as compared to the business as usual condition. We also then saw for both parent-teacher relationship, which is on this slide, and teacher perception of parent values on this slide, an additional benefit of KTP plus specific for Hispanic families. And so the program did seem to impact teachers' perceptions of these things when looking at this specific subgroup. So I want to wrap up quickly so that we can get to these questions. But what we are seeing is some initial evidence that we are seeing improved connections, particularly at the end of the preschool year, and that it seems to be centered around parental involvement, although we do see some additional benefits conferred to Hispanic or Latina families. But obviously we have a lot more work to do, and that we're in the process of doing to see how these actually connect to children's development and children's experiences, and particularly in that transition to kindergarten, which is really what all of this work is kind of gearing up towards. So I want to end with just a huge thank you to our KTP and our ELO teams. These are enormous projects, and it could not have happened without lots and lots of hard work and lots of really just wonderful energy being brought from both of these teams. Here is contact info for both of us. I know Kathy has shared a ton of resources. If you ever find yourself wanting them and don't have access, our website is fabulous and has all of them there too, and you can always ping that. And with that, I will end and turn it back over to Rebecca.
Thanks, Kelly. We do have a lot of great questions coming through in the chat, so we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. I want to start with one that got a lot of upvotes, but I think was from Laura's section from earlier on, talking about the differences in what preschool, the pre-K classroom and the kindergarten classroom looked like. And the question is, shouldn't kindergarten be more about play and hands-on learning instead of rote learning with direct instruction? Isn't that more developmentally appropriate? Can either of you, do either of you want to speak to that?
Well, I will just comment briefly that I don't think direct instruction equates to rote learning. So direct, and that's why I think we're seeing a shift towards intentional teaching, because direct instruction is taken to be this code word that I'm the teacher didactically sitting. And so when I've been in kindergarten classrooms, there are lots of fantastic approaches to intentional teaching that can happen through dramatic play, through shared book reading. And so that's my response to the first part. I think the question is, and I put this out seriously, I don't think we know right now what kindergarten should look like. And so that's why we're getting this, we make it look more like first grade so kids can transition from K to 1, but it doesn't look like pre-K. So I think we have a lot of work to do to say this is actually the optimal experience for 5-year-old kids. Kelly, what would you say?
Yeah, just to add on to that, I think one thing that we have to keep in mind is, and this is where you started, I think, the ways in which we are designing activities and the way time is spent is completely separate from the type of academic content. And we can be delivering really high quality literacy, language, math, science activities in kindergarten in really hands-on, playful modes. And so sometimes I think we conflate these two things, and it's either, you know, all play or all academic learning, when in reality there's so much more nuance. And as Laura said, I think continuing to do the research to figure out what is the optimal way to be combining these things is really important for the future.
Yeah. And Kelly, just to piggyback on that, and then I'll stop, whether it's through play or a different approach, I will say that I will dig my feet in the sand over the importance of explicitly teaching kids things in kindergarten. Whether it's, you know, foundational skills in reading, social emotional competence, basically the things that are in the KRA, you know, that's a whole different talk. But if you look at the strong, significant relations between the skills kids have in kindergarten and how they're doing in 3rd grade, 6th grade, 12th grade, I mean, there's a pathway there that is not questionable about kindergarten being probably the most important year of schooling. So I respect the question. We have to figure out how best to have kids develop these competencies and figure out a way where kids have fun, they love being there, they're motivated. So, yeah.
Thank you both. Another question, I think you answered a similar question in the chat, Laura, but was about whether there's any data on what the transition looks like for based on the setting that children in the study came from. Do you want to speak to that briefly?
Can you comment on that? I do know there was a question from a participant, Sunny, actually asked, do we see more transition difficulties for kids who were in preschool prior and who were not? And actually in our work, we do not. So unfortunately, there is no value add for kids who have been in prior preschool in our Ohio sample compared to kids who hadn't. And frankly, talking off the cuff, I think it's because when we talk about preschool in Ohio, it's all over the place. So we can't say preschool in Ohio helps subvert transition difficulties.
It's all over the place, but also the slides you showed, preschool is really different from kindergarten. And so even though there's some similarities in terms of being in a more formal environment, there's still such discrepancies that's one of the things that I think is also underlying why we don't see that difference.
Great. Yeah, that's so interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. And one of the things we have found, I mean, Kelly and I have been doing large scale studies like this in Ohio for quite a while. And one of the things we find is for kids who are in center-based care, a large number of them are in half-day programs, 2 days a week, 3 days a week, half, and that's even in public schools. So it's a very different model that we see in other states and other cities like Boston or Georgia, where kids participating in preschool, it's a more universal system and it's 5 days a week. So our kids are very heterogeneous.
Right, for sure. I want to do one more question about transition difficulties, that sort of first half of the presentation, and then get to some of the more KTP intervention questions. So one participant asked about the decrease in math and reading gains for children during the transition, and was that dose dependent? So if a kid had 3 challenges, was their decrease in gains more than kids who had one challenge rated by their teacher?
Did we look at that? I don't remember if we did.
This is what I was trying to pull up when you were giving it over to me, and I didn't quite get to it. I'm pretty sure that is actually how we operationalized it, is a dose dependent. But let me double check on that, and I will come back to it, because I'm pretty sure we did, but let me make positive.
Yeah. We have is that paper published? I can't recall.
No.
We did. I mean, we did
almost
a pretty thorough investigation of transition difficulties and its relation to growth. over the years. So that's an answerable question, but maybe not right now.
We'll work on it. Thanks. Getting to the intervention itself, there are some questions about sort of like the practical issues around running this intervention, which I think from, knowing a little bit more about it are really interesting. And one participant asked if parents are open to the home visits and can they choose to opt out or choose another venue. And sort of, I wondered if one of you could talk a little bit more about how that worked.
Sure. So, we don't force anyone to do anything in this intervention. And you can see, so in that first preschool year, 5 home visits are supposed to take place, and on average, families were doing about 3.4. Certainly, one of the things that we experience that I'm sure everyone experiences is families are really busy and juggling a lot of things, particularly families with young kids. And so, we worked really hard to accommodate their schedules. And part of that was also accommodating on location. So there were times where we really liked to do it at home, one, because of privacy and like being able to talk about more things, and two, being able to demonstrate some of the learning materials and things like that. But we also completely recognize that that just wasn't the optimal choice for some families. And so meetings could also happen at places like libraries or other areas where people can meet publicly.
Great, thanks. We had some other questions about the ages of these participants and if there were many children who were already 6 or had been held back a year. If you could speak to that, like specifically about this data, but then also some other questions coming through about the advice to hold back children and have them enter kindergarten a year later, and if any of the data in the study can speak to that at all.
Kelly, it's the red shirt question. So we can talk about that in a second. There's actually research on the value of what we call red shirt in kindergarten. The first question, we enrolled the kids in pre-K who were kids who were supposed to go to kindergarten the next year. So I don't know that we would have had kids who were.
So the first cohort, the oldest kid was 65 months.
Okay.
So still in that they had turned 5, but so that was our range was goes up to 65 months. 45 to 65 months. So we do have a bit of a range, and so there could have been some, but there were more that were kind of in the traditional age.
So I'm chuckling about the red shirting question. One of Kelly's good friends is Jade Jenkins, I think is the top scholar in this area. But I was just looking at my 16-year-old son, who's huge, who he has an October 13th birthday, and we're in Worthington schools. I wanted him to go to kindergarten, as if he was a September 30th birthday, because he's sharp and ready. And he got a kindergarten readiness assessment from Worthington, and they said he's not ready. So they wouldn't let him go ahead by 14 days. I mean, you never know, the alternative future for your kids if he had not been redshirted. I will tell you, he's huge, he's tall, but Kelly, the research is pretty clear that there is no benefit academically whatsoever for keeping it, not putting him back. And there's actually, and Kelly, you chime in, I'll mention 2 things. There's actually some detriment in that if a child has learning vulnerabilities, by not putting them in school, they're not getting identified for disability services. So they're actually withholding educational resources. And it also adversely impacts a family's economic situation by lots of reasons why. Kelly, do you want to add to this?
No, those are great. I'll just say some of the things in the chat that are coming up around this. It is the gender issue, and it's true, Jamie. It is boys, and it's sometimes athletic reasons, but it's also social development reasons get cited a lot as to why boys are redshirted, and kind of like a maturity issue. And I think given the evidence Laura just talked about, I think my counter to that would be, well, how can we think about designing a kindergarten classroom that is better suited to the developmental maturity of children versus thinking about this redshirting phenomenon, which does seem to have some negative impacts in the long term.
And one of the things we do a lot at the Crane Center, we do a lot of work on peer effects, which is there's a child in a classroom, let's say a kindergarten classroom, and they're surrounded by other kids with different skills and competencies. And so we're influenced by the people we spend the day with. So if you have a child who now this is speculation, but if you have a 5-year-old child, a little boy who is socially awkward, for lack of a better word, the choice is hold that kid back and hope they grow out of it, which we don't have evidence that happens, or put them in a classroom with a great teacher and socially competent peers, and that child's going to benefit from their serving as peer models, etc. So I actually think there's a bigger risk of holding a child back than putting them in a classroom with a very competent teacher and a strong peer system. So my 2 cents.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. I'm gonna give you guys a hard one and give you like 2 minutes to answer. So
give me 1 second first. I want to loop back to the earlier question. It is that stepwise. So 3 challenges was connected to a larger kind of decrease in learning as compared to 1. So the number of challenges did matter.
Awesome. Good
Great.
multitasking, Kelly. The question is, what do you suggest Head Start programs do to advocate for equality when it comes to transitioning into school district kindergartens? And I think more broadly, just like, what does this look like in practice outside of this randomized controlled trial study for you guys?
You want to take it, Kelly?
Sure. So I think that is the hard question. You weren't kidding, Rebecca. So these connections are really important that we've talked about, but I think until we really think about building connections across systems, whether it's Head Start in districts or other preschools in districts, we're only going to go so far. And so I appreciate this question a lot. It's something in other work that we've done where we've done interviews across the state. We're kind of shocked by how minimal the connections are. And, there's a lot of barriers to it and a lot of reasons why. I don't have a good answer for the person in Head Start trying to build these connections, but what I do have is kind of a call to everyone to work to build these connections. And so there's the state has a pilot program bringing Head Starts in school districts together that has been successful in its early years. And I think the more that we can think about co-holding events with kindergarten teachers or elementary school personnel with Head Starts and preschools, the more we can think about just opportunities for connections to form there. That's that initial step that we need to then do the deeper work on the transition and on these alignment issues. But again, it's really hard. There's, all sorts of logistical challenges to it. And I think back to that slide of all of the different ways that kids are experiencing preschool prior to kindergarten, and thinking about how do we build these pathways is not an easy task, but I think it's something that we all kind of collectively have to think about how to do moving forward.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Anything to add, Laura?
No.
This has been a wonderful presentation and conversation. Thank you both for sharing your work with us today.
Good to see everybody. Join us again.
Please, and thanks for all our attendees for joining us today. When you leave the meeting, a very short survey will pop up. Please fill that out if you're able to. We do value your feedback and use it to inform future events. Thank you again for joining us and have a great day.